He thought he was kicking out a nobody, but in less than 24 hours, he would realize he had just humiliated the wrong woman. The morning light poured through the towering glass walls of Sterling Luxury Motors, casting sharp reflections across rows of polished vehicles worth more than most homes. The marble floors echoing with the soft clicks of expensive shoes and quiet conversations between people who carried themselves like they belonged there. And then there was Emily Carter, stepping inside in a simple white blouse and worn blue jeans, her sneakers barely making a sound against the gleaming surface, as if the building itself refused to acknowledge her presence. Her eyes calm, observant, taking in every detail of the showroom without a hint of intimidation. Yet to everyone else, she looked exactly like someone who had wandered into the wrong place. Someone out of sync with the tailored suits, luxury watches, and practiced smiles that defined the room. And from across the floor, Blake Thompson noticed her immediately. Not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't fit the picture he had built in his mind of what a real customer should look like, his gaze sweeping over her with quiet judgment as he adjusted his tie, already deciding the kind of interaction this would be before a single word was spoken, while nearby sales associates shifted their focus toward a well-dressed couple entering behind her, their energy instantly redirected to what they considered a more promising opportunity, leaving Emily standing alone for a moment longer than necessary, unnoticed, unwelcomed, yet entirely unbothered. As if she had expected this exact reaction before even walking through the door, her posture steady, her expression composed, the faintest hint of patience in her eyes as she moved closer to a midnight blue coupe displayed under a spotlight, the kind of car that drew admiration from across the room, the kind of car people whispered about but rarely touched, and still no one approached her. Not until Blake finally made his way over, his steps measured, his smile practiced, but hollow, the kind of smile reserved for situations he intended to end quickly. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his tone suggested the opposite, and Emily turned to him with quiet politeness, her voice soft but clear as she gestured toward the car. "I'd like to know more about this model," she said, and for a brief second there was silence, the kind that settles before something shifts, Blake's eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly as he glanced at her clothes again, then back at the car, then back at her. And in that moment, a decision was made, one that would ripple far beyond this showroom, one that would turn a simple request into something else entirely, something heavier, something that would leave the entire room holding its breath before the day was over, though no one realized it yet, not even Blake, who straightened his posture slightly, already preparing the words that would change everything, the faint hum of conversation around them continuing as if nothing was about to happen. As if the world hadn't just quietly aligned itself for a lesson no one in that room would soon forget. Blake let out a short, dismissive chuckle, the kind that did not need to be loud to carry weight, and he glanced briefly over his shoulder toward the other sales associates, as if inviting them to silently agree with him before returning his attention to Emily, his expression tightening into something sharper, more deliberate. "That particular model starts at $285,000. He said slowly, emphasizing each word as though he were explaining something obvious to someone who could not possibly understand. His tone smooth but edged with condescension, and a nearby couple paused just long enough to glance in their direction before continuing their conversation in hushed tones, the subtle shift in the room barely noticeable, yet unmistakably present, while Emily simply nodded once, absorbing the information without flinching, her eyes still resting on the sleek lines of the car rather than on him. "I understand," she replied calmly, her voice steady, almost gentle. "I would still like to see the interior if that is possible." And for a fraction of a second Blake's smile faltered, not because of what she said, but because of how she said it. There was no hesitation, no apology, just quiet certainty, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. But the moment passed quickly as he straightened his jacket and leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it feel personal while still allowing those nearby to hear. "We usually reserve access to this vehicle for serious buyers," he said, his words carefully chosen, each one landing like a subtle push toward the door. "Private appointments, verified clients, that sort of thing." And a faint murmur rippled from a nearby group as if the implication had been clearly understood, the air tightening around them. While Emily finally shifted her gaze to meet his, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady and unreadable. "I am prepared to make a purchase today," she said, not louder, not firmer, just clearer. And the statement hung in the air for a brief moment before Blake responded with a laugh that was slightly louder this time, just enough to draw attention. "A purchase today," he repeated, as though testing the phrase for its absurdity, and one of the junior salesmen nearby looked down quickly, pretending to adjust a brochure while clearly listening. "I think there might be a misunderstanding," Blake continued, now fully committed to the performance, his voice carrying across the polished floor. "This is not a place for browsing or wishful thinking. This is a business." And a few heads turned more openly now, the quiet conversations around them dimming just a little as curiosity replaced indifference, while Emily stood exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides, as if the growing attention did not belong to her at all. "I am not browsing," she replied softly, and that was when Blake's patience snapped, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that shifted his tone from polite dismissal to open condescension. "Then perhaps you should come back when you are dressed for a serious transaction," he said, his voice cutting through the space with deliberate clarity, and for the first time, the room truly went still, the kind of silence that settles when everyone senses a line has been crossed, even if no one speaks it out loud. And in that silence, Emily's eyes flickered, not with anger, not with embarrassment, but with something quieter, something that felt like a decision forming beneath the surface, and she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging not his words, but what they revealed, before turning her gaze back to the car one last time, the reflection of the showroom lights dancing across its surface. And then she looked at him again, calm as ever. "Thank you for your time," she said, her voice carrying a kind of finality that did not match the simplicity of her words. And without another glance at the watching crowd, she turned and began walking toward the exit, her footsteps soft against the marble floor, each one echoing just a little louder in the silence that followed. While behind her, Blake exhaled through his nose, satisfied, convinced he had just handled another interruption, completely unaware that the moment he dismissed her, he had set something in motion that he would not be able to stop. And as the glass doors closed behind her, the room slowly returned to life. Conversations resuming, laughter picking back up, but something lingered in the air, something unspoken, like a quiet warning that had not yet been understood. Outside, the afternoon air felt cooler than it should have, or perhaps it was just the contrast from the controlled luxury inside that made everything seem sharper, quieter, more real. And Emily Carter paused for a brief moment just beyond the glass doors, her reflection faintly visible behind her as the showroom lights flickered across the surface, a place that had just rejected her without ever truly seeing her. And yet there was no anger in her expression, no visible frustration, only a calm, measured stillness, as if she had already processed what had happened before it even unfolded, her mind moving not in reaction but in quiet assessment, because this was not the first time she had been underestimated, not the first time someone had mistaken simplicity for insignificance, and certainly not the first time she had allowed someone to reveal their character without interruption. She adjusted the strap of her bag slightly on her shoulder, her movements deliberate, unhurried, as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb just a few feet away, the driver stepping out quickly, opening the rear door with practiced precision. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, his tone completely different from anything she had heard inside, and Emily gave a small nod as she approached, her demeanor unchanged. As if the shift in treatment was neither surprising nor particularly meaningful, she stepped into the car and the door closed softly behind her, sealing off the noise of the street. And inside, the atmosphere was quiet, refined, familiar, a stark contrast to the judgment she had just walked away from. Her phone rested in her hand for a moment before she unlocked it, her thumb hovering briefly over a contact she did not call lightly. And when the line connected, the voice on the other end carried a calm authority that matched her own. "Daniel," she said simply, and there was a brief pause before he responded, his tone soft but attentive. "Everything all right?" And Emily looked out the window as the car began to move, the dealership fading into the background, its glass walls shrinking with every passing second. "I stopped by Sterling Motors," she said, her voice even, giving no immediate weight to the words. But Daniel did not interrupt. He knew her well enough to understand that silence mattered just as much as speech. "I found something I liked," she continued, "but it seems they were not interested in selling it to me." And for a moment there was nothing but the faint hum of the engine, then a subtle shift in Daniel's tone, not anger, not surprise, but something quieter, something more controlled. "I see," he replied, and that was all he needed to say, because he understood, not just the words, but what had been left unsaid, the judgment, the dismissal, the quiet humiliation delivered under the guise of professionalism. And Emily leaned back slightly in her seat, her eyes closing for just a second as if sealing the moment into memory, not for resentment, but for clarity. "It is all right," she added softly, and this time there was the faintest hint of something beneath her. Calm, not weakness, not hurt, but resolve, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, the kind that waits, patient and precise. "Tomorrow will be better," she said, and Daniel exhaled quietly on the other end, a sound that carried both understanding and decision. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "Tomorrow will be different." And as the car continued down the road, the city unfolding around them in quiet motion, the events inside the showroom already felt distant, almost insignificant. Except they were not, because somewhere behind those glass walls, Blake Thompson continued his day as if nothing had happened, greeting new clients, offering polished smiles, completely unaware that the woman he had dismissed so easily was not leaving empty-handed. She was leaving with something far more valuable, perspective, and a decision that had already begun to take shape, one that would return not with noise, not with confrontation, but with a presence that could not be ignored. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, everything about that showroom would feel just a little different, even if no one yet knew why. The next morning arrived with a kind of quiet precision, the early sunlight stretching across the glass facade of Sterling Luxury Motors as if nothing unusual had ever happened there, as if the previous day had been just another routine exchange in a place built on appearances and assumptions. And inside, the showroom was already alive with movement, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft echo of footsteps across polished marble, while Blake Thompson stood near the center of it all, adjusting his tie in the reflection of a black sedan, his expression composed, confident, completely untouched by the memory of the woman he had dismissed, because to him, she had already faded into insignificance, just another interruption in a day filled with more important clients, or at least that was what he believed, until the sound came, subtle at first, a distant engine, smooth and unmistakably refined, cutting through the usual rhythm of the morning like something out of place, and, slowly, almost instinctively, heads began to turn toward the glass entrance as the sound grew clearer, deeper, not loud but impossible to ignore, and then it appeared, a Rolls-Royce gliding to a stop directly in front of the showroom, its presence commanding attention without demanding it, the sunlight catching along its flawless surface, every detail immaculate, every movement deliberate, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to pause, conversations trailing off mid-sentence, eyes drawn to the scene unfolding just beyond the doors, because vehicles like that did not simply arrive unnoticed. Not here, not ever. And Blake straightened slightly, his posture shifting as recognition flickered across his face, not of the car itself, but of what it represented: opportunity, status, a client worth his full attention. And without hesitation he moved toward the entrance, his demeanor transforming instantly, the practiced smile returning, sharper now, more eager, while behind him the other sales associates watched with quiet anticipation, each one aware that whoever stepped out of that car would matter, would change the energy of the room in an instant. And outside, the driver stepped forward first, opening the rear door with careful precision, his movements calm, respectful, and then there was a brief moment of stillness, the kind that holds just before something shifts, before a presence enters and alters everything. And when the figure finally stepped out, there was no rush, no unnecessary movement, just a quiet confidence that carried across the distance without effort, a tailored suit, perfectly fitted, a posture that spoke of authority without a single word. And as he straightened, adjusting his cuff slightly. His gaze lifted toward the entrance, steady, composed, and in that instant, the atmosphere inside changed completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that everyone felt without needing to explain. Blake's smile widening as he approached the doors, already preparing his greeting, already calculating the value of this moment, completely unaware of the connection that was about to unfold, completely unaware that the story he thought had ended yesterday was only just beginning. And as the glass doors slid open, the space between what he believed and what was real grew thinner with every step, the room holding its breath without realizing why. Blake stepped forward with practiced confidence, his polished shoes gliding across the marble floor as the glass doors opened wider, his smile sharp and welcoming in the way he reserved only for those he believed mattered. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Sterling Luxury Motors," he began smoothly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to signal importance without overstepping. While the man in the tailored suit paused just inside the entrance, his gaze moving slowly across the showroom as if taking in more than just the cars, his presence quiet yet commanding. And for a brief moment, Blake felt the subtle pressure of that gaze, something measured, something deliberate, though he quickly brushed it aside, stepping closer, ready to guide the interaction. "My name is Blake Thompson. I would be happy to assist you with anything you need today," he continued, his tone confident, controlled, while a few feet behind him, the other sales associates lingered just enough to observe, their curiosity barely concealed, because clients like this did not appear every day, and certainly not without consequence. And the man finally shifted his attention fully to Blake, his expression calm, almost unreadable. "I am looking for a specific model," he said, his voice even, carrying a quiet authority that did not need to be raised, and Blake nodded quickly, eager now. "Of course, we have a wide selection, if you would like to follow me." But the man did not move. Instead, his eyes drifted past Blake, toward the interior of the showroom, as if searching for something, or perhaps someone. And there was a pause, subtle but heavy, the kind that stretched just long enough to make Blake adjust his stance slightly, uncertainty flickering beneath his composed exterior. "Actually," the man continued, his tone unchanged, "I believe my wife was here yesterday." And the words landed softly, yet their effect was immediate. A faint ripple passing through the air as Blake's expression tightened just slightly, his mind searching quickly, replaying the previous days. Interactions, dismissals, faces that had blurred into one another, until one memory surfaced, uninvited yet unmistakable, the simple white blouse, the calm eyes, the quiet exit, and for a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his gaze, though he forced a polite smile to remain. "We assist many clients daily, sir," he replied carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Perhaps if you could describe." But the man raised his hand slightly, not abruptly, not aggressively, just enough to stop the sentence before it finished, and the gesture alone was enough to silence not only Blake, but the faint murmur that had begun to rise around them. "Emily Carter," he said simply, and this time, the name did not echo loudly, but it did not need to, because the effect was immediate, unmistakable, Blake's posture stiffening almost imperceptibly as recognition settled fully into place, not just of who she was, but of what he had done, and behind him, one of the junior salesmen glanced down, quickly, as if suddenly aware of something unfolding beyond his understanding, while the man continued, his gaze steady, unwavering. "She mentioned she was interested in a vehicle here, and there was no accusation in his voice, no anger, just a calm statement of fact, which somehow carried more weight than anything louder could have." And Blake felt the room shift again, the quiet attention of others now focused not on the car, but on him, waiting, watching, as the realization pressed in from all sides, tightening like a slow, unavoidable truth. And for the first time since stepping onto that showroom floor that morning, Blake hesitated, just slightly, his carefully constructed confidence faltering beneath the weight of a moment he had not anticipated, a moment that had already begun to unravel everything he thought he understood about who belonged and who did not. And somewhere in that silence, the consequences of yesterday started to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that could not be undone. Blake swallowed almost imperceptibly, the practiced ease in his posture tightening into something more rigid as the name lingered in the air, Emily Carter. No longer just a passing memory, but a presence that now stood between him and the man in front of him. And for a moment he considered deflecting, minimizing, reshaping what had happened into something less damaging. But the weight of the man's steady gaze made that impossible. It was not confrontational, not aggressive, but it left no room for dishonesty. "Yes," Blake said finally, his voice measured, though not as smooth as before. "I do recall her visit." And even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the subtle shift in the room behind him, the quiet awareness of others leaning in without appearing to, sensing that something significant was unfolding. And the man nodded once, not in approval, not in acknowledgement, but simply as if confirming a detail he already knew. "She mentioned she was interested in a specific vehicle," he continued, his tone unchanged, and Blake forced a small smile, one that felt increasingly out of place. "We have many options available. I would be more than happy to personally assist her today," he replied quickly, leaning into recovery, into control, but the man did not mirror his urgency. Instead, he remained still, composed, as if time moved differently around him. "That will not be necessary," he said calmly, and the words landed with a quiet finality that caused Blake's expression to falter for just a fraction of a second. Because this was not how these interactions usually went, not how power typically presented itself in this space. And the man's gaze shifted briefly toward the showroom floor, toward the vehicles arranged with careful precision, before returning to Blake. "She was prepared to make a purchase yesterday," he added, and now there was something else beneath his tone, not anger, not accusation, but clarity, the kind that leaves no room for interpretation, and Blake felt the pressure build, subtle but undeniable, his mind racing through possibilities, explanations, justifications that suddenly felt insufficient. "There may have been a misunderstanding," he began, his voice tightening slightly. "Our policies." But once again, the man lifted his hand just enough to pause him, not dismissive, not abrupt, simply decisive, and the room fell into a deeper silence, conversations fading entirely now, as if everyone present understood that something important was being said, even if they could not hear every word. "Policies reflect priorities," the man said quietly, and this time, the weight of the statement settled heavily, not just on Blake, but across the entire space, because it was not a challenge, it was an observation, one that revealed more than any explanation could conceal, and Blake felt the heat rise behind his composed exterior, not visible, but undeniable, the realization threading through his thoughts that this moment was no longer about a sale. It was about something far more difficult to control: reputation, perception, consequence. And for the first time since he had approached the doors, his confidence wavered in a way he could not fully mask. "I assure you, sir, we value all of our clients," he said, the words sounding rehearsed even to his own ears, and the man regarded him for a brief moment, not dismissing the statement, not accepting it, simply letting it exist in the space between them, before speaking again. "That is good to hear," he replied, his tone unchanged, "because today, you will have the opportunity to demonstrate it." And with that, he stepped slightly to the side, his attention shifting toward the entrance behind him, and instinctively, every eye in the showroom followed, drawn by something they could not yet see, but could already feel approaching. And in that moment, Blake understood, not fully, not completely, but enough to realize that whatever happened next would not be something he could control, only something he would have to face. And the air seemed to hold still, waiting, as if the final piece of the moment was just about to arrive. The glass doors opened once more, and this time the shift in the air was unmistakable, not because of noise, but because of presence, as Emily Carter stepped inside with the same quiet composure she had carried the day before, her simple white blouse and blue jeans unchanged, her posture steady, her expression calm. Yet the way the room reacted to her now was entirely different, every glance sharper, every movement slower, as if the space itself had suddenly become aware of something it had failed to see before. And for a brief moment no one spoke, not Blake, not the other sales associates, not even the clients who had paused mid-conversation, because the connection had already been made. The man in the tailored suit standing just a few feet away, his gaze softening slightly as it settled on her. And Emily met his eyes with a faint nod, not surprised, not overwhelmed, simply acknowledging what was already understood between them. "You found it," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the silence without effort, and he gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "I always do," he replied, his tone steady, and then he stepped slightly closer, not to take control of the moment, but to stand beside her, equal, aligned, and the shift was immediate. The balance of the room tilting in a way that could not be ignored. While Blake remained where he was, his confidence now held together by habit rather than certainty, his eyes moving between them, recalculating, reassessing, trying to recover something that had already begun to slip away. "Miss Carter," he said finally, his voice more measured now, more careful. "I would like to personally apologize for any misunderstanding that may have occurred yesterday." And the words sounded polished, rehearsed, but beneath them there was tension, a subtle strain that had not been there before, and Emily turned her attention to him, her gaze steady, unreadable, not confrontational, not forgiving, simply present. "There was no misunderstanding," she said softly, and the clarity of the statement settled over the room like a weight, heavier than any accusation could have been, because it left no room for reinterpretation, no space to hide behind policy or procedure, and Blake felt it immediately. The quiet precision of her words cutting through everything he had prepared to say, and for a moment he had nothing to offer. In return, no immediate response, only the awareness of eyes watching, of a moment that was no longer his to control, while the man beside her remained silent, allowing the exchange to unfold without interference. His presence alone reinforcing what had already become clear, and Emily shifted her gaze briefly toward the vehicles displayed across the showroom floor. The same polished surfaces, the same carefully arranged luxury. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different now. "I was interested in that coupe," she continued, her tone calm, almost conversational, as if the previous day had been nothing more than a detail. And Blake nodded quickly, seizing the opportunity to regain footing. "Of course, it is still available. I can arrange immediate access, a private viewing, anything you require," he said, his words coming faster now, the urgency beneath them impossible to hide. And Emily looked back at him, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady, holding the moment just long enough to let the contrast settle in, before she spoke again. "Yesterday, I was ready to buy it," she said, and the room went completely silent, every sound fading as if pulled away by the weight of what she was about to say next. And for the first time since she had walked back through those doors, Blake did not interrupt, did not redirect. He simply stood there, waiting, because somewhere deep down, he understood that whatever came next would define everything that had already happened, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Emily let the silence linger just long enough to settle into every corner of the showroom, her words still hanging in the air as she continued, her voice calm, steady, almost gentle. "Yesterday, I was ready to buy it," she repeated, and Blake nodded quickly, as if agreement alone could restore what had already been lost. "And today," she added, her eyes never leaving his, "I am deciding whether I still want to." And the shift was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, the balance of power moving in a way that no one in the room could ignore, because this was no longer about access, no longer about eligibility. It was about choice, her choice, and Blake felt it in the way his posture adjusted, in the way his voice softened, in the way every word he had prepared now seemed inadequate. "Of course," he said, forcing composure back into his tone. "We would be honored to assist you in any way. I can have the vehicle brought forward, arrange a test drive, expedite the paperwork, whatever you need." His words coming faster now, layered with urgency that had not existed the day before, and behind him, the other sales associates stood still, their earlier confidence replaced with quiet observation, aware that something far more significant than a transaction was unfolding. While Emily listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her gaze steady, absorbing every word without reacting to any of them. And then she glanced briefly toward the coupe, its polished surface reflecting the room that had once excluded her, and then back to Blake. "Yesterday, You told me this place was for serious buyers, she said, her tone still soft, but now carrying a clarity that cut deeper than volume ever could. And Blake opened his mouth slightly, ready to respond, ready to correct. But the words did not come, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to reinterpret, only the truth of what had been said. And for a moment, he stood there, caught between explanation and realization, while the man beside her remained silent, his presence steady, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, without interference, because this was not his moment to control, it was hers. And Emily took a small step forward, not toward Blake, not toward the car, but into the space that had once felt closed to her, her voice calm, measured. Serious buyers do not always look the way you expect, she said. And the room went completely still, the kind of silence that does not just follow words, but absorbs them, holds them, reflects them back to everyone listening. And Blake felt it settle over him. The weight of something undeniable, something that no apology could fully erase. And for the first time, his gaze dropped slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition. The quiet acknowledgement of a mistake that had already defined him in this moment, while Emily allowed the silence to breathe, not rushing it, not filling it, letting it exist exactly as it was, because sometimes the most powerful response was not louder words, but space. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the same calm certainty as before. I came here yesterday with the intention to buy, she said. Today, I came back to see if this place deserves my business. And the statement landed with a finality that left no room for interpretation, no space for recovery through charm or urgency. And Blake stood there, the polished image he had built now standing against a reality he could not ignore, while around them, the showroom remained silent, every person present aware that they were witnessing something that had nothing to do with cars and everything to do with respect. And in that stillness, the lesson was no longer subtle. It was unmistakable, written not in raised voices or dramatic gestures, but in the quiet clarity of a woman who had never needed to prove her worth, only to reveal how easily others had failed to see it. The silence held for a long moment after Emily's words settled, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but undeniable, the kind that forced reflection whether anyone welcomed it or not. And Blake stood there, the weight of the moment pressing quietly against everything he thought he understood about his role, his instincts, his judgments, because there was no argument left to make, no explanation that could reshape what had already been revealed, only a choice, and for the first time, it was not his to control. And Emily let her gaze drift once more toward the coupe, the same car that had sparked everything, its polished surface unchanged, flawless, indifferent to the shift in the room. And then she looked back at Blake, her expression calm, composed, as if she had already made peace with whatever decision came next. I would still like to see the car, she said, her voice steady, not demanding, not hesitant, simply clear. And Blake responded immediately, almost instinctively. Of course, he said, stepping forward, his movements now careful, measured, as if every gesture carried weight, and he signaled to one of the associates, who moved quickly to bring the vehicle forward, the energy in the room shifting once again, but this time quieter, more restrained, as if everyone present understood that something deeper than a sale was being corrected, even if it could never be fully undone. And as the coupe was positioned under the light, its door opened with deliberate precision. Emily stepped closer, her hand resting lightly against the surface for just a moment, not in awe, not in hesitation, but in quiet acknowledgement, and the man beside her remained still, watching, not directing, allowing her to move through the moment on her own terms, because that was the point, it always had been. And Blake stood just a few feet away, no longer leading, no longer assuming, simply present, attentive in a way that was no longer performative but learned, shaped by something he had not expected to confront. And Emily glanced briefly at him, her eyes steady, and for a moment it felt as though the entire room held its breath again, waiting for something more, something final. But she did not raise her voice, did not extend the moment beyond what it needed to be. Instead, she offered a small nod, almost imperceptible. Thank you, she said, and there was no edge in her tone, no lingering resentment, only a quiet resolution that spoke louder than anything else could have. and Blake returned the nod, his expression subdued, understanding more in that moment than any training or experience had ever taught him. And as Emily stepped into the car, the door closing softly behind her, the reflection of the showroom lights shifting across the glass, the room slowly exhaled, conversations beginning. Again in low voices, movements resuming. But nothing felt quite the same, because something had changed, not in the cars, not in the building, but in the way people would remember this moment. And as the scene settled into its new rhythm, one truth remained, clear and unspoken, that respect had never been about appearances, and the cost of forgetting that was far greater than any price on the showroom floor. And that day, without a single raised voice, everyone present learned exactly what dignity looks like.